Seated. During these Sundays of Epiphany, we have been talking about the light of God. We begin to trace that light of God on Epiphany Sunday with the star that led the Magi to the manger. And since that day, we've heard messages of the prophets that call us to the light of God. We've remembered the tongues of fire, the Spirit's fire that rested on those on the day of Pentecost. And we've been reminded of the Apostle Paul's encounter with the blinding light of Christ, the light that enabled him to see both Jesus and himself with laser clarity. Light, as we have explored during this season, symbolizes a number of things about God's presence and God's work. It symbolizes enlightenment and love and guidance and revelation and salvation. Today we hear the beautiful poetry of the prophet Isaiah. The people who walked in darkness have seen great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, you, O God, have broken as on the day of Miriam. And then, I don't know if you noticed it or not, I hope you did, then we heard those very same words from the prophet Isaiah, quoted in the Gospel of Matthew, as this prophet's words find expression in the life and ministry of Jesus. Jesus becomes that light that shines on the people of God who are yet again burdened and oppressed and in need of the light of liberation. Liberation. Yet another thing that light describes. It's a primary theme throughout the entire biblical story. That familiar saga of the Exodus is God's call and leading of Moses to set the people free from slavery in Egypt. And Paul writes to the Galatian church, saying, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." In this narrative today, the prophet Isaiah uses images of light and darkness to emphasize the contrast in the life and well-being of the people. A light has shined on those who once lived in the shadows of enslavement. This passage follows the earlier writing in this book of Isaiah, an announcement that a leader would be born who would bring justice to the people. The final word to those who are entrapped in slavery is that God will deliver, that God will liberate the people. God would move their lives from the darkness of captivity to the light of freedom, from the control of their Assyrian oppressors who occupy their land, to autonomy. Their harsh and subjugated lives will be transformed as God, through this radical leader, will set them free. The metaphor of light represents the character of leadership that brings justice, hope, and finally and ultimately liberation. God breaks the yoke of bondage, and the social order of occupation is overturned. All oppression shall cease. The prophet announces, the light will dawn upon them. And when God's light shines, they will flourish in hope and joy and freedom. Now, Isaiah's imagery, if we look at the details of his imagery, it implies two sorts of liberation. The first is political deliverance from slavery, from the yoke that was imposed upon them. You know what a yoke is, right? That puts oxen together. It's imposed. It's for the purpose of hard labor. And so this yoke, the prophet announces, this yoke of forced labor and subservience will be broken. The second sort of liberation is implied with the image of the rod of the oppressor. Think about it. The rod of the oppressor, referring to total control over them with threat. Threat of being hit if they step out of line. This oppression, this threat, this breathing down their necks will too be shattered. What we see here may be painful, but it's true. God chooses sides. God chooses the side of the one who suffers because of the domination of another. God chooses sides so that people can live abundantly and fully. Unjust social structures, then, must go as the light of God's liberation breaks through. Isaiah's historical reference is to the people of Israel, to the Assyrian invasion 7 centuries before Christ. But I believe that we can discover in them our shared human predicament and rediscover God's desire to set people free from all manner of enslavement and suffering. We know that oppression still runs rampant in this world. The powerful controlling and subjugating others. And human beings get trapped internally as well. We get trapped in distress and despair. We too live in darkness. It's part of the human condition. We seek escape, but can't find a way out. We may find a way out for a little while. But God can help us cross over, can move us to freedom, and help us see and live in light. This liberation that God brings, that God insists on bringing, is of course spiritual liberation. But traditional Christian teaching has taken that deep truth that Jesus can set us free in only one way. And I believe it's multifaceted. Jesus, according to commonly held doctrine, sets us free from sin. The idea is that Jesus took our sin on himself, and that's done all that needs to be done. We are free from sin's consequences and are no longer alienated from God. That's what the tradition tells us. But we don't have to have lived very long to recognize that plenty of good Christian people, and Jews and secular folk alike, plenty of good church-going folks, are still enslaved. Enslaved by attitudes and behaviors that take our lives away and cause suffering for ourselves and for those around us. Even though God's healing and liberating love has been made clear in the life and death of Jesus. And according to the Bible itself, that's also been made clear before Jesus and after Jesus. We still find ourselves enslaved in destructive things. So I ask us, do you hold resentment toward anyone? Do you? It can enslave us, can't it? We carry it around and it's heavy. It's a dark shroud over our spirit that keeps us from living in light. Do you hold on to grievances that eat you alive? Whoever it is that offended you might not even know it. But those grievances live in you and hold you captive. Do words of judgment and criticism hold you back and cover you in a pall of negativity? That judgment and criticism may have been given to you by someone else. But does it now spew from your own mouth and taint your own spirit? Are you held captive in fear? Fear perhaps of not having enough, not having enough money or respect or praise or recognition. This fear can live in us and manifest as anxiety or greed or absence of generosity. The slippery slope of this sort of fear is that it feeds itself. We're afraid that we won't have what we need, and pretty soon, no amount of things or love or praise will satisfy. No, we need to be free from it. Free from debilitating fear that keeps us from being generous with each other, with our grace, with our money, with our time. In Sue Monk Kidd's brand new book, The Invention of Wings, that we heard Jody read from this morning, I highly recommend it, by the way. Handful, the slave girl, makes this profound observation. Sarah was trapped the same as me, but she was trapped in her mind. Not by the law or by slavery. Mr. Vesey used to say, be careful, you can be enslaved twice, once in your body and once in your mind. I tried to tell her that. I said, my body might be a slave, but not my mind. For you, maybe for us, it's the other way around. The liberation of the Bible, God's liberation, the liberation that Jesus promises, is spiritual. But it's also social and political. From time to time, I'm asked why our denomination, the United Church of Christ, and our congregation, why are we involved in political issues? The underlying commentary is often that we shouldn't be. We're a spiritual body, aren't we, the church? We and God are concerned about souls and faith, right? Well, of course that's right. But it isn't the whole story. It isn't the whole biblical story of liberation for then or for now. The primary meta-narrative of the Old Testament is that story that we're familiar with, the story of Exodus. God's leading the enslaved Egyptians to freedom. To do this, God intervenes in political systems to set people free from physical and mental exploitation, to move them from slavery to autonomy. And Jesus did similar things. For example, he not only forgave the woman at the well, setting her spiritually free, no, he also made a radical statement. We don't really quite see the radicalness of it today, but it's true. Because he told the woman at the well, he said, go and sin no more. What he did when he said that was he raised her to the status of a full human being who can make her own moral decisions. Unheard of in that day, and in some places even now. Jesus set her free from lies and constraints based on gender that were permeating the political and social systems. Perhaps more than any other theologian and pastor during our lifetimes, Martin Luther King comprehended God's liberation. And he picked up this mantle of spiritual and social freedom. He understood in both a biblical sense and in his experience as a black man in America that God's liberation is a holistic matter. It's freedom of mind and spirit and body and rights. God presses for freedom for human beings, freedom from our own selfish critical thoughts and actions, and freedom from physical, mental, and economic oppression by and in society. In a somewhat controversial speech that we don't hear very often, Dr. King said this: "This movement for freedom must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of our society. There are 40 million poor people here. And one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth, so that all may be free. We've got to begin to ask these questions. Dr. King calls us to see both oppressor and oppressed as those who are in need of liberation. Jesus did it. Jesus cleared the temple on behalf of the poor who were being exploited by the powerful. But he also helped the tax collector, Zacchaeus, find freedom from his prison of complicity with Roman exploitation and greed. Freedom. Freedom for all. Liberation from everything that holds us back and keeps us captive. Regardless of the type of suffering we experience, we all need liberation. We need sweet relief and freedom. Freedom from despair, from cynicism and negativity, from fear and resentment. Politically, we aren't enslaved. Some of us, of course, live as second-class citizens, both in regard to our nation's laws and in access to equal opportunity and compensation. But that isn't true globally. Many in our world live in economic poverty and in social and political danger. Women in parts of the Middle East are literally kept captive and treated as subhuman. Working poor in our own country suffer with unlivable wages. Oppression and threat to LGBT people in Nigeria and Russia maybe are hopefully on our minds. And both the oppressed and the oppressors in our prayers. This sort of treatment, these sort of attitudes are not new predicaments. Almost 20 years ago, when the Olympics came to our city, different than Sochi, yes, but not entirely. When the Olympics came to Atlanta, venues for some events were to be out in Cobb County, where leaders were spouting vitriol towards LGBT people. I was a part of a group of clergy who participated in a movement called Olympics Out of Cobb. One pastor, I remember, really resisted getting involved. He put his hands on his hips and he said, "What does that have to do with Jesus?" He had more than a bit of righteous indignation. My response was, everything. It has everything to do with Jesus. Because it has everything to do with setting people free from oppression and discrimination, from darkness and loathing and fear. It has everything to do with Jesus. When God spoke to Moses from the burning bush, God announced the intention to set the people free, to end the suffering of slavery. Perfect. But how might that come about? The voice of God, as the voice of God does, appealed to a human being, appealed to Moses, saying, "I'm going to send you to Pharaoh to demand that he let the people go." Moses protested, as we might protest. Who am I to do such an audacious thing as that? God's reply, "I will be with you." It's our holy call, my friends, the privileged work of our faith, to be liberators, to open our eyes to the plight of those who are abused, threatened, or robbed of their dignity, and to respond to suffering with liberating words, liberating actions, and liberating prayers. But if we can't give it away, we can't give it away if we don't have liberation ourselves. We're offered it. Freedom. Freedom from all that keeps us from living in love. And so I ask myself and I ask you today, what holds us back? What is it for you that keeps you enslaved in the darkness of despair or fear? People who walked in darkness a long time ago and right here, right now, have seen great light. Those who lived in the land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. Because you see the yoke of their burden, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, God has broken. For freedom, Christ has set us free. For freedom, to live in it, to shine from it, to pass on. For freedom, Christ has set us free. It's declared. It's ready for us to live each day, to remember each morning, and to give away by our actions, by our words, by our prayers, again and again and again. May it be so. Amen. Their burden, and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, you, O God, have broken as on the day of meeting. And then, I don't know if you noticed it or not, I hope you did, then we heard those very same words from the prophet Isaiah, quoted in the Gospel of Matthew, as this prophet's words find expression in the life and ministry of Jesus. Jesus becomes that light that shines on the people of God who are yet that led the Magi to the manger. And since that day, we've heard messages of the prophets that call us to the light of God. We've remembered the tongues of fire, the Spirit's fire that rested on those on the day of Pentecost. And we've been reminded of the Apostle Paul's encounter with the blinding light of Christ, the light that enabled him to see both Jesus and himself with laser clarity. Light, as we have explored during these Sundays of Epiphany, we have been talking about the light of God. We begin to trace that light of God on Epiphany Sunday with the start again burdened and oppressed and in need of the light of liberation. Liberation. Yet another thing that light describes. It's a primary theme throughout the entire biblical story. That familiar saga of the Exodus is God's call and leading of Moses to set the people free from slavery in Egypt. And Paul writes to the Galatian church, saying, for free during this season symbolizes a number of things about God's presence and God's work. It symbolizes enlightenment and love and guidance and revelation and salvation. Today we hear the beautiful poetry of the prophet Isaiah. The people who walked in darkness have seen great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. For the yoke